Well, I could just mention everybody. Let me start by saying that this is a very special moment for me. I think I'm going to cry. This is probably the last time that I will be addressing you as special rapporteur. I don't have many months left. And it has been quite a journey. It has been the greatest honor of my life. And I will always be grateful for all the love you've given me throughout these years. I think for us all, the possibility of being here today is a great joy. The last time we met at the first Global Forum was such an important moment. And we left with so many great hopes, and then COVID came. Now it's the time to resume our hopes, but probably much wiser now, we hope. So let's try to remember a little bit what happened during this pandemic, always remembering those who left us. I think that we also need to remember one very important thing that happened during the first Global Forum for me. And here is Francilene to remind us that the women gathered among themselves. I don't know if for the first time, but for me it was the first time that I saw women affected by leprosy gathering and making their own demands, producing their own statements. That is one of the things that really needs to continue now that we are being able to resume our activities. But I think that during the pandemic something very important happened and that we need to celebrate. The relations between the different organizations of persons affected by leprosy, in my view, grew stronger. The pandemic made everybody wish to being able to connect, to find out how everybody was doing, what were the problems people were facing. And many strategies were put in place to achieve that. Our friend Michael already mentioned the idea gatherings, which continue today. And I believe today there are more strong horizontal relationships between the organizations, and this is a very important sign of progress. When the organizations start to organize among themselves on an horizontal basis, as peers. The women also gathered at Zoom meetings for many different reasons during the pandemic. And I make an appeal to the international organizations that support grassroots and national organizations of persons affected by leprosy to support the organization of women. It is very important that women are able, and for women it's much more difficult. I will never forget one meeting that we organized at the Global Partnership for Zero Leprosy, just to listen to women during the pandemic. And Jayshri, my dear friend, told me, Alice, please be aware that I will not say who, but another woman not from India, she needs to go and prepare dinner. So give her the floor sooner. Women do face many barriers to participation. So we need to provide them more support. But these horizontal relationships between the organizations, which are growing stronger in my view, will lead us to the main goal of any human rights strategy and struggle, which is the self-determination of the people in question. I think that self-determination really needs to be our main goal. And we are at an historical moment in which I see it closer and closer. But the pandemic brought us some important lessons. Well, we identified two types of challenges, which I addressed in a report that I've presented to the Human Rights Council only about the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on persons affected by leprosy and their family members. We identified old problems, structural problems, that were at the root of many of the difficulties that persons affected by leprosy experienced during the pandemic. Discrimination and how it led historically to the exclusion of persons affected by leprosy from the formal work market. The barriers due to discrimination as well faced by persons affected by leprosy to decent work. And all this also led to the fact that during the pandemic, persons affected by leprosy did not have access to social protection schemes. Barriers to education, barriers in the access to health care, all that became too evident during the pandemic. We also saw how discrimination and all these barriers meant that during the pandemic, persons affected by leprosy, many of them, of course, didn't have access to clean water, to sanitation and hygiene, which were absolutely key to stop the transmission of COVID. Many persons affected by leprosy experienced a food emergency, problems with housing, and many difficulties and barriers with regard to access to information, access to healthcare, but also to essential medicines. This brings us to the new problems that the pandemic brought. We all remember the MDD crisis. Some countries, particularly Brazil, did not have access to MDT for quite long periods of time during the pandemic. Not only many persons who had leprosy were not able to be diagnosed, but many of them didn't have access for months to treatment. This was a tragedy. A tragedy that, in my view, was quickly forgotten. But the pandemic also brought bigger visibility to old problems, which were enhanced by the pandemic itself, like gender-based violence and the difficulties that the organizations of persons affected by leprosy have on what regards access to resources. There were very few responses from governments to all these issues, but the organizations of persons by leprosy were very quick in connecting to people on the ground, identifying their problems, but they didn't have resources to offer a solution. So I would say that this is something that the pandemic made quite evident, and this is a very important issue. How do we talk about self-determination, human rights, autonomy, if the very same organizations of persons affected by leprosy have so many difficulties in on what regards access to funding? It's easier for organizations for persons affected by leprosy to have access to international and national funding. And this is something that needs to change. Indeed, the organizations were the first ones to sound the alarm about the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. They mobilized resources, very few, to ensure people's survival. They also were able to sort of creating monitoring systems. And they were the ones providing information to the communities on how could people protect themselves from COVID. Sasakewa Health Foundation was one of the few organizations that recognized this problem of access to resources and provided resources to many of you during the pandemic so you could do your work. But again, I believe this is something that we need to be very much aware, that there is so much will, so much expertise among the organizations, and still so many barriers in the access to funding. Now that the pandemic seems to, or at least the worst is gone, I think we need to evaluate our responses, not only to the emergencies, but also to these old problems that the pandemic made so evident. For a while, I don't know if you remember, all of us were talking about building back better. Remember? All the governments wanted to build back better. Did any government truly engage in building back better? My answer is no. And I had the opportunity to say this to the Secretary General of the United Nations quite recently. The same problems are there. There are no responses in place to inequality, to barriers in the access to social and economic rights. So I think that it would be quite important if we do not forget everything that happened during the pandemic and really try to focus on those old problems, the new problems, and the problems that became more invisible. And for me, I think that there are some points that became quite evident as being in need of more attention from us, and I would like to make an appeal to all of you. Let's try to think about a collective agenda for social struggle against inequality, against the abuse of power, against human rights violations. One first topic for me are indeed economic and social rights. What are these? We are talking about rights regarding education, decent work, social protection, health care. Persons affected by leprosy experience many barriers on regard to these rights, and these are the rights that the government are more reluctant to enforce. Why? Because they demand budget, they demand money, they demand redistribution of wealth. But these are the rights, as Mr. Sasakawa was saying, that really need to be guaranteed to persons affected by leprosy so they can overcome structural discrimination and injustice. So I think that in order for us to have a plan towards the enforcement of these rights, we really need to be very strategic and use international human rights mechanisms and monitoring mechanisms. What is this? My mandate is an international human rights monitoring mechanisms, but there are others. As Mr. Sasakawa was saying, persons affected by leprosy, the majority of them self-identify as persons with disabilities. We have a committee at the UN that works for the rights of persons with disabilities. And there are other committees. There is one that works against violence against women. But there are also regional human rights monitoring mechanisms. And for you that work at the national level, the United Nations has different field presences in your countries. In many of our countries, there is the presence of UN Women that works for the rights of women, of UNICEF that works for the rights of children, the UNDP that puts in place development programs. It would be quite important if you can connect with these UN field presences in your countries. Another topic that I think we all forgotten too quickly was the one related to drugs for treating leprosy. The MTD crisis was a tragedy, and until today, no one was made accountable by what happened. This means that it can happen again. And the drugs we have for treating leprosy reactions are really bad. as you know. So I think we should also have a collective plan regarding drugs. I recall you that people living with AIDS were very, very determined in getting new and better medication for treating AIDS. We can also do something of the kind on the leprosy field. Another topic for me, which is quite central today, regards precisely autonomy, self-determination, and access to resources. But for this, the capacity of the organizations needs to be strengthened. And many of you are doing this, developing your organizations. But I think that it would be quite important also to develop a plan for better access to funding. And the last one regards women and children. We do not have any children today here. We do not we do not have any teenager affected by leprosy. The truth is they are not participating. And they have different experiences, different problems. The gap we had with women affected by leprosy, we need to acknowledge that we have a huge gap that related to the participation of children and teenagers. So I would like to suggest these 4 topics. And tomorrow, Satakawa Health Foundation was very nice in giving me 1 hour to work with you. My friend Amar, my friend Jayshri, my friend Lilibet, and my friend Faustine are going to be with me on this session, and I invite us all to work together on some of these issues. So with this, I would like to thank you, to say that during these 5 years as special rapporteur, I did witness a very, very important process of empowerment of persons affected by leprosy. I'm not saying it didn't happen before. I'm just saying that during these 5 years, that process really was strengthened. And I think that these opportunities where the organizations meet together and develop these horizontal relationships are really precious for the future. So with that, I thank you. Again, it has been the honor of my life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.